Good afternoon. I'm Patrice Nicholas. I'm Director of the Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health at the MGH Institute of Health Professions. And we are co-sponsors along with the Massachusetts General Hospital Center for the Environment and Health. We're delighted to welcome you today for our Grand Rounds webinar. The title is Connections Between Seaweed Farming, Environmental, and Public Health. Next slide. Our speaker today is Dr. Scott Liddell, who co-founded, Scott Liddell, we go by first names here. He co-founded an innovative integrated indoor fish and vegetable farm in Western Massachusetts and managed a research and development program for 15 years. Subsequently, he led a scientific aquaculture program at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole for 15 years, where he researched new methods for seaweed and shellfish farming, including oysters, clams, and offshore mussels. His research and development program over the last 6 years is at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, practical ocean farm cooperation. Include demonstration projects for sugar kelp in Alaska, tropical seaweeds in Puerto Rico, and leadership of a selective breeding program for sugar kelp in New England. We'll also share that our next webinar in May, Wednesday, May 18th at noon, is Environment, Climate, and Health. And the speakers are Carlos Camargo, Professor of Emergency Medicine at Mass General and Harvard Medical School, and Joseph Hodgkin, Assistant in Medicine Hospital Unit at Massachusetts General Hospital, instructor at Harvard Medical School, and board member at the Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. So we welcome Scott Liddell and thank you.
Thank you, Patrice. Everyone can see my slides now?
Not yet.
Okay. Do I need to go back to do a share here? Let's see. Okay. How about now?
Yes, thank you, Scott.
Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, Patrice. It's my honor to be here and to talk to many of those of you on the front lines regarding our healthy future. Let's see if I can get these slides to advance. Okay. Well, one of the first points I'd like to make is the difference that our food choices actually make when it comes to climate change and our impact on this planet. We can kind of measure how the food choices we make impact the land use, which are required to produce that food, the fresh water that's required to produce that food, the feed inputs, and more of interest these days is what is the carbon footprint? What are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with those food types? And here you can see popular protein from agriculture, from beef to pork to poultry, each having their own species-specific impact, much higher than the marine sources of protein, which I think if we're really interested in changing our diets toward a more friendly carbon footprint, ought to be focused more on farmed fish, shellfish, and farmed seaweeds as well. Other more pointed examples here, where we look at chicken as being sort of the baseline, this center line here. You can see that virtually almost all seafood that's farmed, these are examples here from seaweeds, bivalves to salmon and carp, and catfish, and tilapia. They're all lower or equal to chicken in terms of carbon footprint. And these are the kinds of diet choices that we might want to make if we're interested in improving the planet. Also, I think it's worthy noting that when I say seafood, larger and larger proportion of our seafood should be coming from farm sources as opposed to the wild sources. We've flatlined basically how much we can harvest. It's almost the commercial harvest for seafood have been flatlined for 40 years. We just simply can't sustainably fish any more than we already are. And so any increases in seafood production is going to have to come from farmed aquatic species. And certainly we've seen this over the last 30 or 40 years that aquaculture is filling that gap as our population grows. And we'll have to continue to as our population approaches 10 billion by the middle of this century. And we can chart the rise of aquaculture over the last 30 years, from 1990 to nearly 2020 on this chart. And you'll see that the two largest portions here are finfish in the bottom color here, and seaweeds. I'm going to focus my talk mostly on these seaweeds since they're already a third of all the farmed biomass and food that we grow in the oceans. This is a snapshot of where those seaweeds are grown and what proportion of the exclusive economic zone these countries are using for growing seaweeds. And what we notice right away is that the hotspots, China, Indonesia, Southeast Asia in general, this is where 99% of the seaweeds are being grown. It's a very big part of their culture. There are thousands of small farmers engaged in growing seaweeds around these parts of the world. It's a vibrant part of their marine economy, much less so in the US and the developed world in general. But I think that's going to change. Just to note that seaweed production worldwide has doubled over the last 10 years. And it's really the fastest growing sector of any food production in the world. It's nearly a $15 billion business now worldwide. And just to point out that the 2/3 of the seaweeds that are grown can be either classified as red seaweeds, which are grown principally in the tropics, and probably people would be familiar with nori, the type of seaweed that we wrap sushi with, is one of those red seaweeds. It's grown in the temperate or tropical areas. And then kelp species, which is a focus of much of my research, where I'm working on research projects from Alaska to New England here. And I do have a tropical red seaweed project in the Caribbean and Puerto Rico as well. So looking at macroalgae production or seaweed production in the US, as I say, it's very small compared to the rest of the world. In 2018, Maine and Alaska, the most likely places for kelp farming in particular, only produced about 50,000 pounds. But last year, over 1 million pounds were harvested, and this industry appears to be doubling every 2 or 3 years. And much of this is driven by new markets, food, mostly food, that's driving the demand. So you might find in markets now seaweed pasta or something called a kelp burger, which frankly I can't say enough about. This is one of the better vegetarian burgers I've had in years. But we're not going to probably see seaweed being consumed the way it is in Asian countries, where it's consumed in its raw format. It's not even a center of a plate item for them either, but it's likely to be integrated into products that we as Westerners, or Americans at least, find familiar: pasta, burgers, seasonings. There's some clever salsas and pickles that are being produced with kelp and seaweeds as well. But I expect it to be a growing part of our diet. So a lot of the interest and commercial success with seaweed farming in the last 3 or 4 years has been inspired and fueled by a big investment that the Department of Energy has made through its ARPA-E Mariner program. And it was really propelled by this ecological and climate advantage that seaweed has in producing biomass in a way that land-based biomass can't do. First of all, it's not putting any more additional pressure on farmland to produce this kind of biomass. It's not using precious fresh water, where we're seeing the water table sinking in places like Iowa, where 87% of the state is planted in corn. And there's no fossil fuel being turned into fertilizer or needed for fertilizer at all in the oceans. There's enough natural nutrients to fuel seaweed growth and production. So I've been lucky to be part of 4 or 5 of these projects that have been funded by the Department of Energy, all developing sort of the toolbox for propelling seaweed aquaculture into the modern era. Around the world, seaweed aquaculture is still fairly artisanal, and I'd say it still started that way here in the US as well. It's a lot of handwork, it's a lot of backbreaking work that's done by hanging over a small boat. And this program was looking at ways of trying to mechanize and use more modern biotechnology ways of growing kelp as well. So speaking of biotechnology, we really are at a blank slate when it comes to breeding and growing kelp. So I took the initiative to lead a project to selectively breed sugar kelp for its better food and fuel qualities. And so our goal was to develop cultivars of kelp based upon the wild strains available here in New England. And you'll see this picture on the right shows a little bit about just the wild kelp diversity. Just looking phenotypically here, you can see this blade is very different from this long skinny blade. How do they grow if these two were crossed, for instance, or what kind of environment does this grow in versus the longer skinny one? So these are questions that I was asking, and that DOE was interested in funding to see if we could improve the productivity of kelp and kelp farming, making it more cost effective. And we aren't the first to consider selectively breeding kelp or seaweeds. The Koreans have been doing this for 40 or 50 years, and they've actually produced at least 2 very different strains, some that grow very densely along their growing line here, you can see in the water, and some that the blades, they grow singly, almost like tomato plants, where you just want to get the most product out of one plant. So these are huge blades that are for human food, and these tend to be, the more dense blades tend to be fed to animals, which in their case are abalone. So going back to our initial premise to selectively breed kelp, we chose 18 different wild collection sites from the Canadian border to here in Long Island Sound. And we found through a population genetic study that there really was quite a difference in terms of the genetics between these more cold-loving strains and these more warm or heat-tolerant strains in southern New England. So that forced us to create actually 2 different research farms where we would plant crossbreeds from the Gulf of Maine onto this farm and crossbreeds from southern New England onto this farm in Connecticut. And this is what a farm looks like from a side view, if you will. So if this is the water level here, we'd have buoys suspended on the surface that suspend a vertical line across, horizontal line between those buoys. And we have anchors holding this farm in place on the seafloor bottom. And magically, typically the planting season starts in November and harvest is in May or June. So I'm going to give you a little biology lesson here in the life cycle of kelp. So if you see kelp washed up on the beach, you might find what looks like these large blades. where they have a holdfast, something that looks like a stem or a stipe, and then you have this large blade that can be up anywhere from 6 to 10 feet long. Each spring and fall, some reproductive tissue develops in the end of the blade, and that tissue has spores that are contained in there. This is the diploid part of the life cycle that has, these have two sets of chromosomes. The spores are released, and then there's the whole hidden life cycle stage of kelp that few know about. These spores develop into individual male and female gametophytes that will land on a rock or typically some hard surface, and they may grow individually for weeks or months or sometimes even years until the right environmental conditions suggest that the female should start producing eggs, and she releases a hormone that signals the male to release sperm, and voila, we get the two haploid products, egg and sperm, fusing, creating a new zygote, and then the life cycle continues where we have the sporophyte regenerating. And this is very useful for our selective breeding purposes because we can keep these gametophytes, these individual haploid life stages, for decades in little beakers in our lab, and choose to breed an individual female with an individual male at any point in our breeding cycle. So we've introduced some biotechnology tools to actually separate the spores once they are released into a beaker here, into a 96-well plate, so that we know we have an individual spore in each of those plates. And then we can begin to create these uniclonal cultures of males and females. We hold those under red light so that they don't go fertile until we're ready. But once we subject them to white light for a few days, they start to produce the eggs and sperm. And then we can spray the juvenile sporophytes onto what we call seed string that we incubate in a hatchery for 4 to 6 weeks. And that seed string, which is literally looks like kite string wrapped around a 2-inch PVC pipe, it becomes sort of like a chia pet with lots of little sporophytes growing on that string. Then we unroll that string onto ropes in the ocean in November, as I say, and 6 to 8 months later, we have these luxuriant 6 to 10 foot blades growing on the farm, ready for harvest, and the cycle can continue. So when we're planting our different crosses, and we'll plant out anywhere from 200 to 400 different individual clonal crosses in a season, we get, as you might expect, a wide diversity of results. And these are some of the good to bad results that we get. And obviously we're trying to harness the best results to continue to improve our breeding performance. So this is a summary of the last 3 years of crossing at least 200 crosses a year. And in the first 2 years, you might expect that we didn't have anything to really go by in terms of let's just mix up as many different crosses as we could. So the first 2 years, we ended up with typically wet weights around 3 to 4 kilograms per meter. But by the third year, we had enough pedigree information, and we'd also developed a reference genome that was giving us some genomic insights into the different pairs of genes and parents to suggest, we can do better. So we, with our predictive models, we were able to move this average wet weight per meter to almost 10 kilograms per meter. And we had some plots that really hit the ball out of the park here with over 20 kilograms per meter of productivity. And you have to sort of do the math, but typically seaweed are anywhere between 85 and 90% water. And ultimately what we're really interested in is what's the dry weight per meter. And you can see similar results in terms of moving the average over in year 3 with this blue line. But what really astounded us is that we had one plot that was over 4 kilograms per meter dry weight. And that all of these values, these ones in particular, are about 3 times the commercial average yield now. So we're very excited about how we might be able to advance the productivity and the cost effectiveness, and if we can drive down the price of seaweeds, it's more likely to be adopted into wider and wider markets. So at the same time we've been applying these selective breeding and biotechnology advances, we've also been looking at the engineering of farms and how do you do this at scale in an ocean that's typically unforgiving. We would like to move these farms farther and farther offshore, out of the way of conflicting interests with navigation and fishing and other uses of our coastal waters. And so our project in Alaska is focused on this. And you can see this is the ultimate design we've come up with. It uses a technology that's been used for many, many years in holding bridges in place, this catenary line. But we've found that this is a way to keep these parallel lines very close together and optimize the footprint and productivity of a given farm. So this is like almost 3 football fields of kelp growing, where we can we've been able to show we can harvest about 300,000 pounds in this relatively small area. And part of the challenge, as I mentioned in the outset, is that seaweed farming around the world has largely relied on a lot of hand labor, where you would just pick up the line and cut it and have it drop into a bucket or a tote. We're trying to find ways of mechanizing this, and we've developed sort of bespoke little barges here we call the Harvest Buddy, that we can harvest a single line at a time and have it drop into these floating bags. It can all be hauled to shore at once at the end of the day. Or we're trying to use existing fishing boats that are not designed for harvesting kelp, but here we're bringing in 5 lines at once over the bow or the back of this boat and filling up these fishing totes. This is another way to use a lot of excess fishing boats that sit at the dock a good portion of the year, particularly around the season when we're trying to harvest kelp. So some of the ways that seaweed can contribute to climate, seaweed farming can contribute to climate mitigation, is by simply displacing things that we already buy or use or consume that are more carbon intensive. So there are certain vegetables even that we consume as humans that are more carbon intensive. And frankly, with the growing number of mouths to feed, we all should be eating more seaweed as a supplement to the vegetables we eat now. More and more, I think we're going to see that seaweeds could displace some of the soy or corn that animal feeds demand now. It's got many of the same qualities in terms of high energy, high carbohydrate capacity, and protein that animal feeds would be a logical place for seaweeds to be fed once we have already begun to consume as much seaweeds as humans are willing and able to eat. And then there's a growing interest and market for bioplastics. A lot of the packaging and bottles that we produce, plastic bottles, end up in the ocean, sadly, anyway. And if these plastics were made of marine components, it's more likely they would break down once they entered our ocean, and because the marine bacteria are evolutionarily capable of handling those plastics. But obviously, we'd like to see bioplastics of any sort more safely disposed. But all of this just to say that we could avoid a lot of many million tons of carbon dioxide a year if we were to displace some of these uses with farm seaweed. And some of the more controversial, but probably becoming more and more obvious needs to us are coming up with carbon dioxide removal methods. This is an idea that was thought of many years ago, and climate scientists were saying we need to start thinking about this 20 or 30 years ago. But now it's too late to try to cut our carbon emissions at a reasonable rate. And now we need to start thinking about active ways of removing carbon dioxide and sequestering it more permanently than just reducing carbon emissions. So here at WHOI, we're focused on 3 in particular, but a lot of these need more research before they ever become commercially or socially acceptable. One is adding iron or nutrients to the water surface to create blooms that would then sink to the ocean, taking carbon with them. Another is adding like a big Tums or alkalinity pill to the ocean, spreading this carbonate material to reduce CO2. And the third that I've stepping into very, very cautiously is that seaweed farming could, in fact, be ways of sucking up and sequestering CO2 and then sinking it to the deep ocean, where if we get it below 1,000 meters deep, it should be sequestered for over 100 years, maybe thousands of years. It was not the first choice, I think, for the best use of seaweed farming when we have these other alternatives to replace more carbon intensive means of our supplies and consumption. But it may be one of the methods that we need to include in all the other techniques that we're looking at for reducing our climate impact and reducing carbon dioxide, period. So what would that look like if you were to intentionally grow kelp and you wanted to do this at a gigaton scale, which is really what we need to do very quickly? So a gigaton of CO2 is captured in a farm area equivalent to the size of New England. So think of New England land stretched out along our coastline on the eastern seaboard here or the western seaboard. That's about 182,000 square kilometers. Or put another way, it looks small when you consider it's only 1.6% of our US exclusive economic zone, but it's still substantial. It's about 2,000 times the size of the seaweed industry right now. So this would be a moon shot, if you will, to expand the industry this quickly. But that's what some advocates of climate solutions are suggesting needs to happen between now and 2050. And we could get there at a somewhere about 10 to 20% growth in the seaweed industry annually, if the investment was made. So what are the challenges to executing some kind of a carbon dioxide removal with seaweed farming? Well, the first is regulatory and social license. I probably have a lot more hair on my head if the dozens of research and commercial projects that I've been involved with in the ocean were easier to permit. But there's a whole host of other stakeholders that need to be consulted, and there are certainly going to be unintended impacts of expanding seaweed aquaculture, and we need to do that at a pace that we can understand and monitor and pull back if we exceed those the impacts that we deem socially acceptable. We also need to develop markets in concert with seaweed farming expansion. As I say, the markets for substituting these other carbon intensive supplies isn't mature yet. And part of the issue is it's a chicken and egg problem. Seaweed farming isn't being conducted on a large enough scale for a bioplastics manufacturer, for instance, to build a plant. They want to do that near where there's supply and have not just 1 million pounds, as I described the U.S. industry growing right now. They need to have 10 million pounds, and it's coming at them at a steady rate of 1 million or 2 a month, and we're just not there yet. Engineering in the offshore environment, I described this very briefly, but this still needs to be proven, and the question of how you scale and avoid navigation issues and the like, those are still ripe for development, and also automating the work in the environment in the open ocean, because you can't be working over the side of a small boat tending a kelp farm in a very high wave, high energy environment. Likely you need to be doing this in the water with some kind of robotic or mechanized system. So the scale up opportunities offer engineers and technologists great opportunities for innovation, because the current seaweed farming industry is pretty basic. So I think there's great opportunities for disruption there, but the challenges are going to be huge too, not just regulatory and social license wise, but also in making sure that we're doing this in a sustainable way and not causing more inadvertent problems than we're solving. And that sort of goes to the unintended consequences of scale. We don't really fully understand if we were to sink a bunch of seaweed to the seafloor bottom. First of all, you need to transport it to those deeper waters so that it's going to last for centuries. And second of all, it's not a desert on the seafloor bottom. What would be the benthic impacts? What are you creating a free lunch for something that is going to have some feedback loop that could create other environmental hardship or disasters? So we need to conduct the science around small demonstration projects for this idea of sinking seaweed before we let the commercial interests and those who are interested in collecting carbon credits that might fund this kind of effort, that the science needs to lead, not the commercial impacts. And then one of the things that we are working very hard on here at WUI, with our expertise in developing sensors and autonomous underwater vehicles, is how do we monitor long-term the fate of that sequestered carbon? We need to really understand, does it last for hundreds of years in those waters? And we have different floats and monitoring devices that we can set up to pilot that kind of monitoring. And I won't go through this exhaustively, but I've already touched upon some of the co-benefits of seaweed farming in creating habitat for nursery species and improving the fisheries around seaweed farms. The seaweeds also sweeten the water. They offset the ocean acidification that climate change is facing our oceans, and can help create a sort of a halo effect for any shellfish that are growing around there too. But there are risks and hazards that we need to consider as well. We don't want to have seaweed farms become so big that they're sucking all the nitrogen out and leaving a desert for the phytoplankton that might otherwise grow there. We need to consider the design of farms so that they can't entangle marine life. And something we're particularly acutely aware of here is the rare and endangered right whale. It's unlikely we're going to see large farms far offshore here in New England where they might come in conflict with marine mammals. So a little bit more about the market opportunities. to achieve this critical scale that seaweed farming may well reach here in the West, as it has in Asia. Obviously, the Department of Energy, that's been at the root of much of my funding, is interested in these biogas or biofuel opportunities. But there are plenty of chemicals that are made from seaweeds as well, and I'll show some examples in the next slides. I've talked a little bit about the ecosystem services. These are another way that seaweed farmers may earn some income. There may be carbon credits associated with the natural carbon that's swept away from farms and makes it into natural sediments without the active approach of actually harvesting, baling, and sinking seaweeds into very, very deep waters. There is some natural sequestration of carbon in more local waters as well, although it's a fraction of what is actually harvested. And another promising opportunity is that there are certain types of seaweeds, a particular type of red seaweed, in fact, that when fed to ruminants, like cows, it reduces their carbon emissions, their methane emissions, by up to 90%. So there are some seaweed farmers that are focused on growing, scaling up the growth of these red seaweeds to create a feed amendment. Less than 1% of the diet is required to create this very large carbon credit benefit. If you could reduce the methane emissions from cows and cattle and dairy cows, which contribute almost 10% of our global greenhouse gases, that would be a huge, huge benefit. And then on the human food perspective, I think I've described this a little bit in my early going, but these are some of the examples of the food products that are available here in the US from some innovative food processors. This one's in Maine. These guys are from Alaska. And I know locally I can get this kelp burger. Really, really highly recommend that you reach out and look for seaweed products and add them to your diet. And some of the reasons for doing that is that just the functional food value of seaweeds is very, very high. It's relatively high in protein, low in fat, but these rich concentration of minerals and vitamins and trace elements that we just don't find in our land diet, land-based diet is really some of the best advantages. And you don't need very much, just 10 grams or 100 grams of seaweeds is equivalent to a kilogram of fresh vegetables. Some of the other uses that those of you in the biomedical world might be familiar with is agar comes from different types of seaweeds, both reds and browns, and it's used for making plates for bacterial growth and sampling. Alginate is very important in other biomedical applications, for instance, this wound dressing. And for seaweeds to really grow and expand, I think I probably touched on this earlier, but it's really a social enterprise. There are really 6 fundamental changes that need to happen for our society to embrace and adopt and make the most of what seaweed has to offer our society. And the first one is the licensing. We need to not make ocean farming kind of the poor stepchild to our historical fishing or recreational boating, or it often is facing competition from those sectors when it really could be fishermen could also be farmers as well as fishing. They don't have to be competitive. Once the licensing issues are smoother and more well addressed, then I think we'll find public investment will be much more attractive, public and private investment in the seaweed space. And we need to have a strong and collaborative stakeholder network. This is scientists talking to regulators, talking to the farmers, all working toward the same mutual goals of a sustainable and environmental friendly industry. Right now, the safety standards are not very clear about how much seaweed can you eat. Some seaweeds concentrate arsenic or iodine, iodine being an important element in our diet. We often supplement that in our salt, but there are certain health conditions where you do not want to have too much iodine. So having seaweed better certified and understanding its safety standards is another element that needs to be developed better. And then raising public awareness, like I'm trying to do right now, about the benefits and potential of seaweed, because I think it's really overlooked in the pantheon of climate solutions and the pantheon of healthy diets. And finally, what my role is to leverage all the great science and engineering that I have in my institution here, and it's buried in small companies that are trying to advance seaweed and ocean farming in general. And it's a really exciting space. I'm very proud and happy to be part of this network. And finally, many people ask, well, so what would the future look like? And I haven't found a US example of this, but the EU is a good analogy for the United States in terms of the market size, the similar maturity of the seaweed industry now, and where could it be in the next 10 years? And by all accounts, it could be a $9 billion market in 10 years in Europe, I think similar in the US. And what would it do in terms of creating jobs? So there could be at least 100,000 jobs created as the seaweed industry were to develop. This is not just seaweed farmers, but all the downstream processors and suppliers of seaweed farms as well. And we see this as a great opportunity to revitalize our coastal communities, many of which are suffering from overfishing and the loss of jobs around our fishing communities. And ultimately, I'm hoping that health practitioners like yourselves will extol the virtues of improved diets that are lower on the food chain, more vegetable based, and sea vegetables ought to be a part of that. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the Department of Energy's Mariner program for producing much of the funding for my work, and I'm happy to open it up to a wide discussion of any of your interests.
Thank you so much for that, Scott. Wow, I learned a lot about kelp, and I'm definitely going to check out the kelp burgers. So I'll be Googling that soon. So we have some questions in the chat, well, in the Q&A, and a few about nutrition and nutritional value. And if I could just start off with a quick question. You talked about kelp being used as a means to remove CO2 from the ocean. And I was kind of wondering if ocean acidification has impacted either the growth process or the nutrient value.
Yeah, ocean acidification actually works to kelp's advantage. It's kind of like CO2 in the air for poison ivy on land here. We hear that poison ivy loves our replete CO2. It's the same with plants in the ocean as well. They thrive on environments that are higher in CO2. So it's not going to have an effect on kelp, but the reverse is true. Kelp is having it's helping to absorb that excess CO2 in the oceans, which means more atmospheric CO2 can go into the oceans and lower the atmospheric CO2.
Great, thank you. And then I have a very specific question, and I might flub up this name, but someone asked, is kelp a source of eicosapentaenoic acid? And also a few questions concerning omega-3.
Right. Yes, kelp in particular are not very high in these fatty acids. They do have some omega-3s and the EPA and the DHA that you typically find in fish, because they are, what oils they do have are of marine origin. But they you know, it's between 0.5% and 1% of their dry weight is typically lipids. It's pretty small. It doesn't mean that we, you know, one of the things that's being considered in, for instance, the production of bioplastics is to put it through a kind of a biorefinery process where you extract the lipids and the proteins and just simply use the carbohydrates for the bioplastics. So those proteins and lipids would each have their own individual values, maybe to go back into diets for fish or animals or even humans. But they're not like microalgae, which are typically more lipid concentrating than the macroalgae, which are more carbohydrate or protein concentrating.
Great, thank you. And then kind of a follow-up question about omega-3s and its relation to iodine. Can people who have an iodine allergy consume kelp? I guess is the easy way to consolidate that question.
Well, I think it depends on there are, if you know you have an acute sensitivity to iodine, then I would avoid kelp. There are plenty of other types of seaweeds that are not as high in iodine. I believe nori is one of them. I'm failing to remember exactly the quantity of iodine that we have in our kelp here in New England. But I know that you, as a typical consumer, you would have to eat hundreds of grams of kelp, dried kelp, a day to reach any kind of high iodine level in your diet.
Great,
So
thank you for that.
the average consumer would not have to worry about that.
And then there were also a few questions about the wildlife entanglement, which you touched on.
Mm-hmm.
And one question in particular is, are there ways to make the kelp lines detachable, like some of the newer fishing lines, to minimize entanglement risks?
Well, what we've done is created weak links. So if, for instance, a whale were to enter a farm, there are intersections where the ropes meet other ropes that have links that would break away if they were under any, you know, if they were under 1,000 pounds of pressure, that would break. So that's been our solution, is to make the farm stable under normal ocean conditions. But if a large force like a whale were to encounter it, the farm would break.
Great. Our kelp burgers, you've got some interest in the kelp burgers and other food products widely available in supermarkets yet?
This one is not. The manufacturer I mentioned, Akua. I'm lucky that there's a place here in Falmouth called the Fisherman's Pantry. If you're driving on your way to the vineyard and going through, it's right off the main drag. They stock these kelp burgers and a wide variety of other kelp-based products. So Fisherman's Pantry in Falmouth is the only place I know of. I'm sure there's got to be somewhere in Cambridge, I would imagine, that also has them, but you can't. Oh, somebody's noting that they order them online. Yeah.
Great. And then we've got two questions that are similar around what can we do as regular citizens to promote and advocate this work? And are there legislative items that support your work?
Well, I think some of the most pressing legislative items are to fulfill the climate agenda that the IPCC and international bodies have been promoting for some decades now. Seems like we're finally getting some traction with the federal government, at least the government in charge at this date. But it's we need to put our research dollars where our mouths are and conduct some of these demonstration projects that we thought decades ago were wacky geoengineering. I certainly thought that, but now I see we've got to try something, even if it's only a small scale, just to understand the science and the risks around it, because we're running out of time. I fear for my children and my grandchildren what kind of world we're leaving for them. There are very few solutions that we shouldn't try on a small scale, because most of them are reversible. And I think every day we vote with our feet in terms of what choices we make and how we transport ourselves, what we eat. Just keep choosing the most climate-friendly alternatives when you can.
Okay, and kind of as a follow-up to that, someone has in the chat that they're a firm believer that climate change inertia can be overcome when the desired positive agenda creates an investable opportunity. Is this something you're beginning to see or that you see in the seaweed world?
Yeah, I think the carbon market will begin to propel investment of both research dollars and commercial opportunities in these carbon dioxide removal technologies. They'll need certain regulatory guardrails around them. They'll need well thought out scientific monitoring and verification. And not all the projects that are on the books right now have those. So that's the other sort of legislative and science agenda that needs to sort of become comprehensive and collaborative to create both economic incentives and scientifically verified.
Great. I think we've covered everything. Let me just go back and see. There is one question early on when you were talking about how do you adjust for varying growth environments in seawater to interpret growth rates and yields?
Sorry, say that again. How do you adjust?
This was kind of earlier on in your talk. How do you adjust for varying growth environments in seawater to interpret growth rates and yields? Great
question. So what we're doing is we're planting all our strains in a common garden. Kind of like if you wanted to compare your Burpee's tomatoes versus your Johnny Seed tomatoes. You plant them in your same garden, you grow them side by side, and you say, oh, well, this Burpee variety grew much better. That's what I'm going to plant next year. So that's sort of what we're doing with our strains. We're growing them side by side in common gardens. But that doesn't tell us much about how that strain might grow in another garden. So this is the first year, as I stand here now, we just conducted our first harvest of this new year class, where we've planted the same strains on different environments and different farms. And now we'll begin to look and see what is the genotype by environment interaction and how universally productive are these strains. So that is something we're deep into plumbing right now.
Okay, and I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, and one was in the chat earlier about do you find any microplastic intrusion into the kelp?
No, kelp aren't absorptive in that way. In fact, kelp are quite the opposite. They're always sloughing off carbon or slime as a way of protecting themselves from other things growing on them. So we don't see any evidence of microplastics intruding into kelp.
Great. And perhaps we can close it out with this question. Are there specific ways that you would recommend for health professionals to help? For instance, is there collaborative work we could do to help? Or do you see a role for health professionals, I guess, in your line of work?
Certainly, and I wish I had more time to dig into the nuances. I mean, there if you Google seaweed and health and diets, you know, the macrobiotic food community has been examining that for many years. If you Google seaweed #4 health, there's a whole network of seaweed scientists that are focused strictly on the nutritional and benefits of different types of seaweeds for particular chronic conditions too. I wish I had the time to investigate that, and I would love to team up with those of you in the health profession to study that more. And if there were ways that, for instance, particular types of compounds which are unique to seaweeds could be enhanced in a breeding program, I'd love to explore that as well.
Great. And so it sounds like, from what I'm kind of interpreting from your answer too, is that we have a role, you know, perhaps in patient education when we're talking to people about their diets or trying to get healthier, that, you know, to kind of keep seaweed somewhere in our mindset, or kelp, which I don't think for most, I can speak for myself, that's not the natural place to go when you're talking to people about healthy diets.
Right. Yeah, and there are whole cookbooks devoted to cooking with seaweeds. And I'm not an aficionado yet. I'm actually going to be taking a cooking course next week on seaweeds, so I can be better informed about this. But I'm a firm believer that this is the way we need to go with our diet changes. More marine, more vegetarian, and seaweeds are the best combination of both.
Great. Thank you so much. Patrice, I'm going to hand it back to you. Again, this was really enlightening and mind expanding. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you also, Scott, for a very informative presentation. Those of us in the health professions do not go to kelp when we educate about nutrition with our patients in general. So you've shifted how we'll provide care. And the last statement I'll make is, someone in the audience asked, which cooking course are you taking? And we'll end on that.
Yeah, I think the course is sold out, but it's a course associated with the Northeast Aquaculture Conference and Expo next week in Portland, Maine. And what I would do, if you're interested, is to reach out to the Sea Grant coordinator in Maine. Her name is Jacqueline Robideau, and ask her when they're going to offer it again, because there's interest, and maybe they should come down to MGH and offer it.
Yes. Scott, thank you so very much. I think that your work should be featured in the Harvard T.H. Chan Sea Change, their climate change center. They have a newsletter called The Climate Optimist.
I noticed that in the chat. I'm going to have to check that out. Yeah.
Yes, I would love to see your work in that.
Great.
We thank you so very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.